I am Zariah, 29 years old. I stood in the middle of a lavish country club ballroom surrounded by 80 of the wealthiest people in the city. My father raised his champagne glass proudly, declaring my sister the diamond of our family. Then his eyes locked onto me and a cruel smirk crossed his face. He loudly mocked my boyfriend, calling him a poor dirt farmer in front of everyone. The room erupted into laughter. What my arrogant father and my sister's wealthy new-in-laws did not know was that my poor farmer boyfriend owned the very ground they were standing on. He held their entire financial future in the palm of his calloused hands. By the end of the night, the laughter would stop, and two families would be completely destroyed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a household obsessed with status meant that love was always conditional. My older sister Chantel was the golden child. She was the one my parents Derek and Yvonne paraded around like a trophy. Tonight was her ultimate triumph. We were gathered at the Oak Ridge Country Club celebrating Chantel's engagement to Julian Kensington. Julian was the heir to the Kensington restaurant empire, a massive chain of high-end dining establishments owned by his billionaire father, Richard Kensington. The ballroom was dripping in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables covered in white silk linens. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with expensive champagne. My parents had spared no expense to impress the Kensington family. I knew they had drained their savings and maxed out multiple credit cards just to rent this specific venue. They wanted nothing more than to secure their place in high society, desperate to prove they belonged. I sat near the back of the room with my boyfriend Kendrick. We were practically hidden behind a floral arrangement. Kendrick wore a simple, well-tailored charcoal suit. He did not wear flashy designer watches or diamond cufflinks like the men at the Kensington tables. He was quiet, observant, and deeply grounded. My parents despised him from the moment they met him. They saw his calloused hands and worn work boots and immediately labeled him a failure. They had no idea that Kendrick was the chief executive officer of Oasis Agri Trust, a massive agricultural and real estate conglomerate. Kendrick preferred to keep his wealth entirely hidden from the world. He always told me that money shouts, but wealth whispers. Tonight, however, the shouting from my family was about to become completely unbearable. The gentle clinking of a silver spoon against a glass echoed through the massive room. The low murmur of wealthy guests gradually faded into silence. My father, Derek, stood proudly at the head table. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo jacket and beamed with pride. He looked out over the sea of 80 guests, his chest puffed out with sheer arrogance. "Let us raise our glasses," my father began, his voice booming through the microphone. "Tonight we celebrate the union of two magnificent families, but most importantly, we celebrate my beautiful daughter, Chantel." Chantel smiled demurely, lifting her hand to flash her 3-carat engagement ring for everyone to see. She was radiant, soaking up the attention like a sponge, completely thriving in the spotlight she always demanded. My father continued his speech. "Chantel has always been the diamond of our family. She is ambitious, elegant, and she knows exactly what she deserves in this world. Julian, you are a very lucky man to have won the heart of our greatest pride and joy." The Kensington side of the room broke into polite applause. Richard Kensington nodded in agreement, raising his glass toward my father. It was a picture-perfect moment of upper-class unity. I took a quiet sip of my sparkling water, feeling a familiar tightness forming in my chest. I was used to my parents elevating Chantel above me, but I truly hoped they would leave me out of their grand performance tonight. I just wanted to eat my dinner and go home to my peaceful life. I should have known better than to expect basic decency from my own family. The applause died down, but my father did not put the microphone away. His eyes scanned the room, moving past the wealthy socialites, until they landed squarely on my table in the far back corner. The warm, fatherly smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, condescending sneer, that I recognized all too well. "And then there is my other daughter, Zariah," my father said. The microphone amplified the sharp, mocking tone in his voice, making sure every single person heard him clearly. Every head in the ballroom turned to look at me. I froze in my seat, my heart suddenly pounding violently against my ribs. My father let out a dry chuckle that echoed through the speakers. "Tell me, Zariah, are you still in love with that poor farmer of yours? I certainly hope his little vegetable harvest pays off this season. Maybe next time he can afford to buy you a better dress for a classy event like this." A heavy, agonizing silence hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Then, the entire room erupted into laughter. The Kensington guests pointed their fingers and snickered loudly. Chantel covered her mouth, giggling uncontrollably at the head table. The humiliation burned through my veins like liquid fire. My face felt incredibly hot, flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and uncontrollable anger. I looked over at Kendrick, who was sitting perfectly still. His jaw was tightly clenched, his dark eyes fixed on my father with a terrifying, calm intensity. I gripped the fragile stem of my champagne glass so hard I thought it would shatter into pieces. I gathered every ounce of my strength, ready to stand up, kick my chair back, and scream the truth at all of them, right then and there. But just as I shifted my weight to rise, a sharp set of manicured fingernails dug fiercely into my bare shoulder, and a hand violently pulled me back down into my seat. The sharp nails digging into my shoulder blade sent a shock of pain radiating down my arm, causing me to gasp and twist around in my seat. I looked up to see my mother Yvonne standing directly behind my chair. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure rage, but it was carefully hidden behind a tight fake smile for the benefit of anyone in the ballroom who might be watching us. "Sit down and shut your mouth," she hissed through clenched teeth. Her grip on my bare skin tightened so fiercely that I was absolutely certain she was going to draw blood and leave bruises. I fell back into my seat, the fight momentarily drained out of me by the sheer shock of her physical attack. "You are not going to make a scene tonight, Zariah," my mother whispered, her voice dripping with venom and desperation. "You are not going to ruin your sister's chance with a wealthy white family just because you are jealous and bitter about your own life." I stared at her in absolute disbelief as the music in the ballroom continued to play softly in the background. "Jealous?" I whispered back, my voice shaking with a mixture of profound hurt and burning fury. "Dad just publicly humiliated me and Kendrick in front of 80 people, and you are telling me that I am the one ruining the night." My mother leaned in closer, her heavy, expensive floral perfume suffocating me. Her eyes darted frantically toward the head table, making sure the Kensington family was not paying attention to our dark corner of the room. They were too busy laughing and toasting to notice the toxic war happening in the shadows. "Your father was just making a harmless joke." She snapped her fingers, still digging into my collarbone to keep me pinned in place. "It is not our fault that you brought a literal dirt farmer to a high society engagement party. Look at him, Zariah!" She turned her vicious gaze toward Kendrick, who was sitting calmly beside me. My mother looked him up and down with absolute disgust, taking in his simple charcoal suit and his lack of a shiny designer watch. "He does not belong here," she sneered, her words meant to cut as deeply as possible. "He looks like he just stepped off a dirty tractor and borrowed a cheap suit from a local thrift store." "Why do you always insist on choosing such absolute losers, Zariah? Why must you always drag yourself down to the lowest common denominator when your sister is out here securing a billionaire heir? You are an embarrassment to this family, and you are an embarrassment to yourself for settling for a man who plays in the mud for a living." The words hit me like physical blows to the chest. For 29 years, I had listened to this exact same rhetoric from the woman who gave birth to me. I had listened to my mother relentlessly praise Chantel for her superficial beauty and her ability to manipulate men with money, while constantly tearing me down for working hard and building an honest, quiet life. I looked over at Kendrick, expecting him to be furious or hurt by her cruel insults, but his expression remained completely unreadable. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply reached out and placed his large, warm hand over mine, gently squeezing my fingers to remind me that he was right there, and that he was not going anywhere. His quiet, unshakable strength gave me the courage I desperately needed to fight back against the woman who was supposed to protect me but only ever saw me as a burden. I forced my mother's hand off my shoulder, pushing her manicured fingers away with a forceful shove that made her stumble back a half step. "You want to talk about embarrassments, Mother?" I asked, my voice low and trembling with a dark rage that had been building inside me for over 2 decades. "Let us talk about who actually acts like a loser in this family. Do you remember 2 years ago when your health insurance completely ran out after your expensive knee replacement surgery? Do you remember sobbing on the phone to me because the hospital was going to send your account to a collections agency, and you were utterly terrified that your wealthy country club friends would find out you were completely broke?" My mother's face instantly went pale under her thick layer of perfectly applied makeup. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out as she struggled to maintain her composure. I leaned closer to her, making sure she heard every single syllable I was about to say. "Who paid that $20,000 medical bill?" "Mother," I asked, my voice razor sharp and unforgiving. "Who worked 60-hour weeks at the design agency, taking on exhausting freelance projects late into the night just to keep a roof over your head and keep the debt collectors away from your front door?" "It was not Chantel. Your precious golden child was too busy blowing her credit cards in Las Vegas, trying to snag a rich husband by pretending she came from old money. She did not send you a single dime when you were crying in physical therapy. I did. I paid for everything while she partied." The air between us felt thick and entirely suffocating. My mother's eyes widened in sheer panic as she realized I was finally pulling the darkest skeletons out of the family closet. She hated being reminded of her own financial failures, and she deeply despised the fact that she owed her current comfort to the daughter she openly considered a massive failure. "Lower your voice," she demanded frantically, glancing around the brightly lit room to see if anyone had heard my devastating confession. "You are rewriting history, Zariah. I am your mother, and you owed me for raising you all those years. You do not get to throw a few medical bills in my face to justify your terrible life choices today. You are just trying to deflect from the fact that your boyfriend is nothing but a broke laborer, while Julian Kensington is going to inherit a massive restaurant empire." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that caught slightly in my throat. My mother was so completely blinded by the shiny, glittering facade of the Kensington family wealth that she could not see the massive reality sitting right in front of her face. She was so desperate to climb the social ladder and be accepted by high society that she was willing to step directly on my neck to get there. She was perfectly willing to let her husband publicly humiliate me and my partner just to secure a few cheap laughs from a room full of arrogant, wealthy strangers. I looked at her face, seeing the deep wrinkles of constant worry and the desperate, pathetic hunger for validation that drove every single decision she made. I felt a sudden wave of genuine pity wash over me. She was a miserable woman, living a completely miserable lie. "And what about Chantel?" I whispered, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms defensively over my chest. "Do you really think her life is so incredibly perfect, Mother? Do you honestly think she is marrying Julian out of pure love? Or is she just marrying his father's bank account because her own credit score is completely ruined and she has nowhere else to go?" My mother gasped loudly, placing a trembling hand over her chest in mock outrage. "How dare you speak about your own sister that way?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, hateful warning. "Chantel is marrying into prestige and incredible power. She is elevating our family name to heights you could never dream of. You are just trying to drag her down into the mud with you and your little farmer boy, because you simply cannot stand to see her succeed where you have failed." I was about to tell her exactly how wrong she was about Kendrick and everything he represented. I was about to tell her that the man she was calling a broke laborer was actually the chief executive officer of Oasis Agri Trust, holding a personal net worth that would make the mighty Kensingtons look like small-town grocery store owners fighting for pennies. But before I could even open my mouth to unleash the heavy truth, the entire dynamic in the room suddenly shifted. The loud laughter at the head table completely died down. I looked past my mother's tense shoulder and saw that Chantel had noticed the intense exchange happening at our lonely table in the back. Chantel whispered something softly into Julian's ear and patted his chest, playing the role of the devoted, sweet future wife to absolute perfection. Then she pushed her heavy wooden chair back and stood up, smoothing down the expensive fabric of her custom white engagement dress. Her eyes vanished entirely from her face. It was vanished entirely from her face. It was immediately replaced by a cold, calculating, and utterly sinister smirk that chilled me straight to the bone. She picked up her crystal glass of expensive champagne and began walking slowly and deliberately across the room, heading straight toward our corner with bad intentions written all over her face. Chantel glided across the polished dance floor, her heavy silk dress trailing behind her like a royal cape. She made sure every single eye in the room followed her deliberate movement. Guests paused their hushed conversations and turned in their chairs to watch the beautiful bride to be interact with her notoriously difficult younger sister. As she reached our small table in the corner, she let out a loud, dramatic sigh that was entirely performed for the wealthy audience surrounding us. She placed her perfectly manicured hand on the edge of our table, making sure her giant engagement ring caught the bright light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Zariah, darling," she said, her voice projecting loudly enough for the entire Kensington family to hear from the head table. "I could not help but notice the little disagreement you and Mother were having over here in the dark. You know it completely breaks my heart to see you struggling like this, especially on a night that is supposed to be exclusively about family unity and celebrating love." My mother immediately stepped back, her stiff posture changing from an aggressive attacker to a meek, supportive bystander, now that her precious golden child had arrived to take complete control of the narrative. Chantel looked down at Kendrick with an expression of deeply exaggerated pity. She tilted her head, pouting her lips as if she were looking at a miserable stray dog that had somehow wandered into a five-star luxury hotel. "Kendrick," she began, speaking incredibly slowly and loudly, as if he could not understand basic English or possess the intelligence of a child. "Julian and I were just talking at the head table, and we both agree that it is just so incredibly sad to see you working yourself to the absolute bone out there in the dirt for basic pennies. Julian has a remarkably generous heart, you know. He actually authorized me to offer you a position at one of the Kensington family restaurants starting as early as next Monday morning." She paused for maximum dramatic effect, looking around the room to ensure the important guests were absorbing the full extent of her incredible grace and generosity. "They need a new dishwasher at the downtown location," she announced proudly. "It is minimum wage, of course, but it comes with a free meal at the end of every shift, and it would finally get you out of the mud and into a highly respectable establishment. You could even learn a thing or two from Julian about how real successful businesses operate in the modern world. You might even work your way up to a busboy if you show some real dedication." The sheer audacity of her insulting offer hung in the air like a foul, suffocating smell. I felt the hot blood rushing to my ears, making my face burn with fresh anger. I looked past her at the crowd of wealthy guests who were actually nodding in solemn approval, murmuring softly to each other about how incredibly kind and gracious Chantel was being to her less fortunate struggling sister. They bought her entire manipulative act completely, swallowing the false narrative of the benevolent wealthy bride offering sweet charity to the poor, uneducated peasant boy. I turned to look at Kendrick, fully expecting him to finally snap and tell this arrogant woman exactly who he was and how many luxury restaurants his company could buy and sell before breakfast. But Kendrick just sat there, radiating an almost frightening level of peaceful calm. His broad shoulders were relaxed, and his expression remained completely neutral. He did not speak a single word in his own defense. Instead, he simply reached under the table and gently wrapped his large, warm hand around mine. His thumb rubbed slow, soothing circles against my tense knuckles, grounding me in the stark reality of the present moment. He was silently letting me know that he was unbothered by the opinions of small-minded people. More importantly, he was letting me handle my toxic family in my own way, without stepping on my toes or letting his male ego take control of the situation. "No, thank you, Chantel," I said, keeping my voice remarkably low and steady, despite the storm raging inside my chest. "Kendrick is perfectly fine with his current career path. We do not need your condescending charity or Julian's leftover minimum wage dishwasher jobs. We are perfectly happy with the life we are building together." Chantel let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that grated painfully against my nerves. "Oh, Zariah, you always were so fiercely stubborn to your own absolute detriment," she mocked, leaning closer so her heavy, expensive perfume mixed toxically with my mother's scent. "There is absolutely no shame in accepting a handout when you are clearly drowning in poverty. You cannot honestly look me in the eye and tell me that you actually enjoy this dirt-stained lifestyle of yours. Waking up before the sun even rises to smell pig manure and constantly worrying about whether it is going to rain just so you can afford to pay your basic utility bills. You are almost 30 years old, Zariah. It is time to stop playing in the dirt with this simple farm boy and start living in the real adult world." "Look at me," she commanded, gesturing grandly to her expensive white dress and the extravagant ballroom filled with wealthy socialites. "This is what true success looks like. This is what happens when you make smart, strategic choices instead of always settling for absolute mediocrity. You could have had a life like this if you were not so obsessed with romanticizing the working-class struggle. Julian is offering your boyfriend a rare lifeline to step out of the trailer park and into civilization, and you are too proud and bitter to just say thank you." I stared at her for a long, silent moment. I looked at her gesturing proudly to an expensive dress she certainly did not pay for, standing in a lavish room. Our parents went into massive, crippling debt to rent while wearing a massive ring from a man who, as far as I knew, was just as superficial and arrogant as she was. The absolute glaring hypocrisy of her standing there lecturing me about smart financial choices and true success finally snapped the very last fragile thread of my patience. The polite, quiet younger sister she had bullied, manipulated, and talked down to for 29 long years was officially dead and gone. I slowly pulled my hand away from Kendrick's warm grasp and sat up completely straight in my chair, letting my polite, respectful facade drop entirely as I decided it was finally time to expose a tiny, devastating fraction of Chantel's pathetic reality to the entire room. I looked Chantel directly in her eyes, watching the smug satisfaction dance across her perfectly contoured face. She was so incredibly confident that I would just sit there and take her abuse like I had always done when we were kids. But I was not a child anymore, and I was completely done protecting people who would gladly throw me to the wolves to save themselves. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the ballroom fill my lungs, and then I spoke. My voice was no longer the quiet, submissive whisper my family was so used to hearing. I projected my words, making sure they carried effortlessly over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "You know, Chantel," I said, tilting my head slightly to mirror her earlier condescending posture. "Maybe you are right. Maybe I should ask Kendrick if he has any spare change lying around in his dirty farm pockets. Do you think he might have enough to help me finally pay off that $40,000 credit card debt you secretly racked up under my social security number during your senior year of college?" The words hung in the air like a dropped grenade. The soft murmurs of polite conversation at the surrounding tables came to an abrupt and complete halt. Women in expensive silk gowns stopped mid-sip of their champagne, turning their heads so quickly their diamond earrings caught the chandelier light. Men in tailored tuxedos slowly lowered their forks to their porcelain plates, staring at us with thinly veiled shock. The silence that washed over our corner of the room was so thick and heavy, it felt like you could slice it with a butter knife. Chantel's smug smile completely dissolved. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like she was going to pass out right there on the polished hardwood floor. Her mouth fell open, but the witty, cruel comeback she was undoubtedly searching for simply refused to materialize. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing that the wealthy high society friends she had tried so hard to impress had heard every single word I just said. Identity theft and massive hidden debt were not exactly the kinds of dinner table conversation the Kensington family appreciated or tolerated in their elite circles. Before Chantel could even attempt to formulate a coherent lie, my mother and father were suddenly hovering over our table like frantic vultures sensing a dying animal. My father Derek slammed his heavy hand down on the white tablecloth, causing the fine silver cutlery to rattle loudly against the china plates. "Zariah, have you lost your absolute mind?" he hissed, his face turning an angry, violent shade of purple. "How dare you sit here and make up such disgusting, malicious lies about your own sister on the most important night of her life? You are completely delusional, and you are ruining everything we have worked so hard to build." My mother Yvonne immediately grabbed Chantel's arm, pulling her slightly behind her in a protective maternal stance, as if I were a wild, rabid dog about to attack her precious golden child. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Yvonne announced loudly, making sure the affluent guests at the neighboring tables could hear her desperate, pathetic attempt at damage control. "Our youngest daughter has always had a wildly overactive imagination. She has been deeply jealous of Chantel ever since they were little girls playing in the backyard. It is truly a mental sickness. She just cannot handle the harsh fact that Chantel is moving up in the world while she is permanently stuck dating a common, uneducated laborer. We have tried repeatedly to get her professional psychiatric help for these awful delusions, but she simply refuses to listen to reason or accept reality. The absolute audacity of my parents trying to convince a room full of strangers that I was mentally unstable just to protect Chantel's fragile facade of perfection made my blood boil hot in my veins. They knew exactly what Chantel had done to me all those years ago. They knew about the forged signatures on the banking documents, the maxed-out premium credit cards, the relentless collection agencies calling my phone day and night right after I graduated with my design degree. They had begged me not to press criminal charges back then, crying on my living room floor and pleading that a felony record would completely ruin Chantel's incredibly bright future. They forced me to take on the crushing financial burden entirely alone, telling me that family always protects family, no matter what. I had worked double shifts and eaten cheap ramen noodles for years while Chantel flaunted her stolen designer handbags on social media. And now, here they were standing in a room full of millionaires calling me a crazy, jealous liar directly to my face without a single ounce of shame. "I am not crazy, Mother," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady, refusing to let them see me break. "And I am certainly not jealous of a woman who has to steal her younger sister's identity just to afford luxury clothes she cannot actually pay for. If you really think I am making this up, we can pull up the official police report I drafted 5 years ago. I still have the scanned paperwork saved directly on my phone. I would be more than happy to pass it around the room so everyone in the Kensington family can see exactly what kind of brilliant strategic financial choices Shantae has been making behind closed doors." My mother gasped loudly, pressing a trembling hand to her pearl necklace in exaggerated horror. My father took a sudden threatening step forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides as if he genuinely wanted to physically drag me out of the building by my hair. Sensing the physical threat, Kendrick smoothly shifted his body weight slightly, positioning his broad shoulders between me and my father, a silent but deadly warning that if Derek took one more step, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Seeing that intimidation was not going to work, Chantel immediately shifted tactics. She began to force large fake crocodile tears to fall from her eyes, playing the delicate wounded victim to absolute perfection. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a pathetic little sob that echoed clearly in the quiet tension of the ballroom. That was all it took. The sound of Chantel's fake weeping caught the attention of the man of the hour. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor as Julian Kensington marched rapidly away from the head table and pushed his way forcefully through the small crowd of curious guests that had gathered to watch the drama unfold. His jaw was set in a tight, angry line, and his expensive tailored suit jacket flared out behind him as he moved. Julian positioned himself directly in front of Chantel, throwing his arm around her shaking shoulders and shielding her completely from my gaze. He looked down at me and Kendrick with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if we were nothing more than toxic trash that had somehow blown through the front doors of his exclusive country club. Julian Kensington stood tall and imposing, his expensive designer jacket sharply contrasting with the ugly sneer twisting his features. He tightened his protective grip around Chantel, who was continuing her pathetic performance of muffled sobs against his chest, playing the role of the fragile victim to absolute perfection. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice echoing with the unmistakable tone of a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. "You come into my family's country club, eating our catered food and drinking our expensive champagne just to launch a jealous, unhinged attack on my future wife. I will not tolerate this kind of ghetto behavior in this establishment." The heavily racialized insult hit the air like the crack of a whip. I felt my jaw clench so tightly my teeth began to ache. The sheer nerve of this arrogant white man stepping into a family dispute he knew absolutely nothing about. Just to throw his inherited wealth and status in my face was completely infuriating. Julian looked down his narrow nose at me, his pale blue eyes filled with absolute contempt and an undeniable sense of racial and economic superiority. "You need to learn how to respect your betters, Zariah," he said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Chantel has told me all about your little jealousy issues, but I never imagined you would stoop so low as to invent completely baseless lies about credit card fraud just to ruin her special night. You are pathetic, and frankly, you are incredibly lucky. My father did not have his private security drag you out the moment you walked through those front doors." My parents stood just a few feet away, nodding vigorously in agreement with Julian, completely abandoning their own daughter to suck up to their wealthy future son-in-law. My father, Derek, even opened his mouth to apologize to Julian, begging for his forgiveness. But the arrogant heir simply raised a single manicured finger to silence him instantly, reducing my father to a subservient child. It made me absolutely sick to my stomach to watch my own parents bow down to this pompous man simply because his last name was printed on a few luxury restaurants. "You see?" Zariah Julian continued, a smug and deeply arrogant smile spreading across his face as he enjoyed the sound of his own voice. "People like Chantel and me are building an actual legacy. We operate on a completely different level of existence than you do. In fact, my family is currently finalizing the paperwork for a brand new $50 million farm-to-table eco-resort. It is going to be the most exclusive luxury destination on the entire East Coast, serving only the finest organic ingredients to billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. We are acquiring tens of thousands of acres of pristine, rolling hills to build a completely self-sustaining paradise. It takes real vision and massive generational wealth to pull off a project of that absolute magnitude, something a bitter little worker bee like you could never even begin to comprehend." Julian then slowly shifted his condescending gaze away from me and let it settle heavily onto Kendrick. He looked my boyfriend up and down, taking in his simple charcoal suit and his calloused working hands with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "And as for you," Julian sneered, taking a deliberate step forward to try and physically intimidate Kendrick, "I know exactly what your type is. You come in here smelling like dirt and cheap soap, thinking you can sit at the same elegant table as the Kensington family just because you put on a tie. You are nothing but a common, uneducated laborer." Julian leaned in closer, jabbing his finger in the air just inches from Kendrick's chest. When my family opens our $50 million eco-resort, men exactly like you will be begging us for minimum wage jobs just to feed yourselves. You will be scrubbing the mud off the floors of my luxury lobby and carrying the heavy luggage of our wealthy guests for spare change. So before you let your crazy girlfriend run her mouth again, I suggest you both learn to know your place. The silence that followed Julian's vicious speech was absolutely deafening. The wealthy guests who had been eavesdropping on our argument were practically holding their breath, waiting to see what the poor dirt farmer would do next. My mother let out a quiet sigh of relief, clearly believing that Julian had successfully put us in our place and salvaged the elegant atmosphere of the engagement party. I looked at Kendrick, fully expecting him to grab Julian by his expensive lapels and show him exactly what a common laborer could do to a spoiled billionaire heir who had never worked a hard day in his life. But Kendrick did not move a single muscle in anger. Instead, he slowly reached up and adjusted his simple necktie, his face remaining an absolute mask of unbothered calm. When he finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice carried a quiet but terrifying authority that instantly commanded the attention of every single person standing within earshot. $50 million, Kendrick said, his tone thoughtful and remarkably conversational, as if they were casually discussing the weather over morning coffee. That is certainly a very ambitious project, Mr. Kensington. A farm-to-table eco-resort requiring tens of thousands of acres of pristine land. It sounds like a massive undertaking for your hospitality group. Tell me exactly, where is this grand resort of yours being built? Julian let out a sharp, arrogant laugh, clearly mistaking Kendrick's peaceful, calm demeanor for absolute submission. He puffed out his chest, incredibly eager to brag about his family's expanding empire to a man he considered completely beneath him. It is being built out in Oak Creek County, Julian declared proudly, his voice booming across the quiet ballroom, making sure everyone could hear his massive triumph. We are securing the absolute best agricultural land in the entire state. The final land lease is sitting on my father's desk right now, just waiting for the signature of some reclusive landowner who controls the entire territory. Once that ink dries, we will own the entire valley, and your little farming friends will be working for me. A thick, heavy tension suddenly descended upon our corner of the room. Kendrick simply stood there looking at Julian with eyes as cold and deep as the dark ocean. Slowly, the corners of Kendrick's mouth turned upward into a mysterious and deeply chilling smile that made the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. It was the terrifying smile of a predator who had just watched his arrogant prey willingly walk directly into a steel trap. Oak Creek County, Kendrick repeated softly, tasting the words on his tongue as his dark smile grew slightly wider. What an incredibly fascinating coincidence. Julian completely missed the terrifying weight behind Kendrick's words. He just scoffed, rolling his eyes as if Kendrick had said something completely stupid. "Whatever you say," Farmer Julian muttered, waving his hand dismissively, before turning his attention back to my sister, who was still dramatically dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk tissue. But my father Derek did not miss the exchange, and he was absolutely livid. The veins in his neck were bulging against his tight tuxedo collar as he shoved his way past a confused waiter to get directly in Kendrick's face. "How dare you!" My father hissed, his voice trembling with a level of rage I had rarely seen before. "How dare you speak to Julian Kensington in that tone of voice? Who do you think you are, coming into this venue, eating the food I paid for, and disrespecting the man who is about to elevate this entire family into the upper class? You are absolutely nothing." My father then turned his blazing, furious eyes onto me. The look he gave me was so filled with pure hatred that it actually made me take a physical step backward. "You brought this trash into my daughter's engagement party, Zariah." He spat his words, hitting me like physical strikes. "You brought him here just to humiliate us because you cannot stand that Chantel is getting the life you always wanted. Well, I am not going to let you ruin this night. I am giving you exactly one chance to fix this disaster." He pointed a rigid, shaking finger at the floor between us. "You are going to apologize to Julian and Chantel right now," he demanded, his voice rising so loud that several more guests turned to stare at our table. "You are going to beg for their forgiveness, and then you are going to tell your worthless boyfriend to do the same. And if he refuses, you are going to dump him right here in front of everyone and prove that you still have some tiny shred of loyalty to this family. If you do not do exactly as I say, you can turn around, walk out those doors, and never come back." The sheer absurdity of his demand hung heavily in the air. He actually wanted me to apologize to the man who had just insulted my partner and the sister who had stolen my identity. He wanted me to humiliate myself just to protect his fragile social climbing ego. Before I could even formulate a response, my mother Yvonne stepped up beside him, completely aligning herself with his toxic ultimatum. "You should just listen to your father, Zariah," my mother said, her voice surprisingly cold and detached, as if she were speaking to a stranger on the street rather than her own flesh and blood. "You have always been such a massive burden to us. Ever since you were a little girl, you always had to do things the hard way, always rebelling, always making us look bad in front of our friends. Sometimes I sit awake at night and deeply regret the fact that we even had a second child. You were a mistake, Zariah. A painful, embarrassing mistake that we have had to carry around for 29 years. The words hit me squarely in the chest, knocking the wind entirely out of my lungs. A mistake. A burden. For my entire life, I had bent over backward trying to earn their love. I had paid their bills. I had kept their secrets. I had swallowed my own pride just to keep the peace in our house. And this was what it all amounted to. In the desperate pursuit of rubbing elbows with a billionaire family, my mother was finally willing to say the quiet part out loud. She did not love me. She had never loved me. I stood there looking at the faces of my mother, my father, and my sister. They stood united, a wall of absolute toxicity and fake prestige. And in that exact moment, something incredibly heavy finally lifted off my shoulders. The desperate, lifelong need for their approval simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a profound sense of absolute clarity. My family was completely broken, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to fix them. More importantly, I realized that I no longer wanted to try. "I do not owe any of you an apology," I said, my voice remarkably steady and calm. "The only mistake here is how much of my life I have wasted trying to protect people who would sell my soul for a country club membership. You want me to leave? Fine, I am leaving, and you can keep your fake, perfect family." I reached down and picked up my small clutch purse from the table. I turned to Kendrick, who was watching me with a look of deep, quiet pride in his eyes. He offered me his arm and I took it, linking my hand firmly through his. We did not run away. We did not lower our heads in shame. We simply turned our backs on my toxic parents and the arrogant Kensington heir, preparing to walk out of those heavy oak doors and never look back. The wealthy guests parted slightly to let us through, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and eager gossip. I could hear Chantel let out a triumphant little laugh behind us, clearly thrilled that she had successfully pushed the unwanted sister out of her spotlight. I focused my eyes completely on the exit, ready to step out into the cool night air and begin my new life entirely free of their heavy, suffocating weight. But just as we were about 10 feet away from the exit, a loud, piercing screech of microphone feedback echoed through the massive ballroom, causing everyone to wince and cover their ears. The soft jazz music was abruptly cut off. "Ladies and gentlemen," a booming, powerful voice commanded over the sound system, instantly silencing the entire room. "Everyone, please direct your attention to the front." I stopped in my tracks, looking over my shoulder. Richard Kensington, the billionaire patriarch of the family, had stepped up onto the small wooden stage at the front of the room. He tapped the microphone twice with his heavy gold ring, demanding absolute silence. My father immediately puffed out his chest, clapping his hands together, eagerly, anticipating the grand toast that would finally seal his family's entry into high society. My mother quickly fixed her hair, trying to look completely perfect for the billionaire. But Richard Kensington was not looking at Chantel. He was not looking at Julian or my parents. His sharp, calculating eyes were scanning the crowded room, moving frantically past the tables of wealthy elites until they locked directly onto the exit, until they locked directly onto the man standing right beside me. Even though his eyes had briefly swept past us near the heavy oak doors, Richard did not immediately process who he was looking at in the dim lighting. His mind was entirely focused on the grand performance he was about to deliver. Richard cleared his throat, and the harsh sound echoed through the massive speakers, pulling his attention back to the eager crowd. He held a crystal flute of expensive champagne in one hand and adjusted the microphone stand with the other. The room was completely silent. My parents, Derek and Yvonne, stood frozen near our table, staring up at the billionaire patriarch with expressions of absolute worship. They looked at him as if he were a divine being descending to bless their pathetic lives. My mother leaned forward slightly while my father clasped his hands together. Chantel and Julian quickly scrambled back to their seats, posing perfectly for the photographers, capturing every moment of this spectacle. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard began, his voice smooth and dripping with arrogance. "We are gathered to celebrate the union of two families. My son Julian is preparing to take his rightful place within the Kensington Empire, and he has chosen Chantel to stand by his side." Richard paused, taking a deliberate sip of his champagne. He did not sound warm or affectionate when he spoke about my sister. It sounded much more like a cold corporate merger than a romantic wedding announcement. But Chantel did not care at all. She beamed with pride, practically glowing under the bright chandelier lights, completely convinced that she had secured her permanent ticket into the upper echelon of the financial elite. But tonight is about much more than just a wedding. Richard continued, his sharp eyes sweeping slowly across the sea of wealthy guests. Tonight is about legacy. It is about the long-term future of the Kensington name and the strategic expansion of our business empire. For 3 generations, we have dominated the luxury restaurant industry in this state. We have built our fortune by serving only the finest dining experiences to those who can afford the best. But the global market is changing, and the Kensington brand must aggressively evolve to meet the high demands of a new modern era. We are no longer just selling expensive meals. We are selling an unmatched luxury lifestyle. My father nodded vigorously in the background, hanging on to every word Richard spoke. That is exactly why I am proud to formally announce tonight that the Kensington Hospitality Group is breaking ground on our most ambitious project to date, Richard declared. We are building a $50 million farm-to-table eco-resort located in the pristine rolling hills of Oak Creek County. This resort will be a totally self-sustaining paradise, catering exclusively to the most elite, wealthy clientele in the entire country. We are talking about secluded villas, organic vineyards, and a world-class culinary experience, sourced directly from the acres surrounding the property. The wealthy guests in the ballroom broke into a loud round of applause. Julian puffed out his chest, looking incredibly smug, as if he had built the entire project with his own bare hands, instead of simply inheriting the money. I stood near the exit with Kendrick's warm hand wrapped securely in mine, listening to this arrogant billionaire boast about his plans. I could feel subtle tension radiating from Kendrick's shoulders, but his face remained a mask of calm. He watched Richard speak with a mild, almost clinical interest. Richard waited patiently for the applause to die down before he leaned closer to the microphone, lowering his voice. "Of course, a commercial project of this scale requires the perfect location," he explained. "We have spent the last 2 years quietly acquiring exclusive rights to the most fertile, untouched land in the state. The Oak Creek Valley is the undisputed crown jewel of our new empire. There is, however, one final piece of the puzzle that we are waiting to secure," Richard admitted, offering the crowd a charming, self-deprecating smile. "The vast majority of the valley is tightly controlled by a rather elusive agricultural conglomerate known as Oasis Agri Trust. They are the undisputed masters of organic farming and sustainable real estate development in this region. The entire $50 million resort depends completely on securing a permanent land lease and an exclusive supply chain contract with this company. We have been actively negotiating with their corporate lawyers for over 6 months, trying to finalize the details. The founder and chief executive officer of Oasis Agri Trust is a notoriously private individual who rarely makes any public appearances. Richard took another slow sip of his champagne, holding the crystal glass delicately. In fact, I was informed by his executive team just this morning that the CEO was currently traveling on business in Geneva, Switzerland, Richard told the crowd. We are simply waiting for him to return so we can sign the official paperwork and begin pouring the concrete. It is only a matter of time before the ink is dry and the Kensington legacy is permanently secured for the next 100 years. Richard smiled broadly, stepping back from the microphone and raising his glass higher into the air, preparing to deliver his final toast. To Julian and Chantel, and to the unstoppable future of our family, he proclaimed loudly. As he raised his glass, Richard's sharp eyes casually swept across the back of the crowded ballroom one more time. The bright stage lights shifted slightly, illuminating the dark corners near the exit. He looked past the tables of cheering socialites, past my parents who were clapping, and past the floral arrangements. His gaze drifted directly toward the heavy oak doors where Kendrick and I were standing. This time there were no shadows to obscure his vision. Richard Kensington completely stopped moving. His arrogant smile vanished from his face in a fraction of a second. His eyes widened in absolute shock, finally recognizing the tall, quiet man wearing the simple charcoal suit standing right beside me. The heavy crystal champagne glass slipped right through Richard's trembling fingers and crashed violently onto the hard wooden stage, shattering into 100 sharp pieces. The sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet ballroom. Expensive vintage champagne splashed violently across the polished wooden stage and soaked directly into the cuffs of Richard Kensington's tailored trousers. But the billionaire did not even seem to notice the mess. He just stood there for a brief, agonizing second, his mouth hanging slightly open, staring wide-eyed at the back of the room. The wealthy guests sitting at the front tables gasped in surprise, whispering furiously to each other behind their hands. A few people half stood up from their chairs, wondering if the powerful patriarch was experiencing some kind of sudden medical emergency. But Richard was not sick at all. He was in a state of absolute blind panic. He shoved the heavy metal microphone stand out of his way so aggressively that it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor, sending a horrible high-pitched screech of audio feedback echoing through the massive speakers. He completely ignored the terrible noise. He practically leaped off the low stage, moving with a desperate, frantic energy that entirely contradicted his usual composed and arrogant demeanor. He began to walk rapidly down the center aisle, pushing past the impeccably dressed waiters holding silver trays. He shoved past confused socialites who reached out trying to ask if he was all right. He did not say a single word to any of them. His eyes were locked entirely on our quiet corner of the room, like a laser beam focusing on a specific target. Chantel and Julian, who were standing just a few feet away from the center aisle, saw the billionaire rushing in their general direction. Julian's chest puffed out with absolute pride, clearly assuming that his father had been so deeply overcome with emotion during his own grand speech that he simply had to come down and publicly embrace his son. Chantel immediately smoothed down the front of her expensive white silk dress, her face lighting up with a massive, triumphant smile. She practically shoved Julian aside, stepping directly into the middle of the aisle with her arms spread wide open. She was entirely ready to receive a warm fatherly hug for the professional photographers who were rushing forward to capture the touching family moment. My parents were equally trapped in their own pathetic delusion. My father, Derek, quickly wiped his sweaty palms on his tuxedo pants and stepped forward, heavily anticipating a personal handshake from the man who held the keys to their high society dreams. My mother, Yvonne, held her breath, her eyes shining with greedy, toxic excitement. They all genuinely thought this was it. They thought this was the crowning moment of their absolute success. It was the ultimate validation that abandoning me and kissing up to the arrogant Kensingtons had been the greatest strategic decision of their lives. Richard closed the distance rapidly, his expensive leather shoes slapping loudly against the polished marble floor. Chantel tilted her head, smiling brightly as she prepared to welcome her billionaire future father-in-law into her arms. But Richard did not slow down. He did not even look at her face. He brushed right past Chantel with so much aggressive forward momentum that the heavy fabric of his suit jacket actually spun her around, causing her to stumble awkwardly in her designer high heels. He walked right past his own son Julian, completely ignoring the confused and hurt look that flashed across Julian's face. He pushed past my father Derek, who had his hand extended awkwardly in the empty air. Richard treated all of them like they were nothing more than invisible, annoying obstacles blocking his urgent path. The entire room watched in stunned, absolute silence as the billionaire patriarch of the Kensington hospitality empire stopped abruptly right in front of the heavy oak doors. He stopped right in front of me and Kendrick. Richard was breathing heavily, a thin layer of cold, nervous sweat glistening on his forehead under the bright chandelier lights. For a man who had just spent the last 10 minutes bragging to a room full of elites about his immense wealth and untouchable power, he suddenly looked incredibly small and desperately terrified. Richard Kensington, the man who made politicians and corporate executives tremble in his powerful presence, slowly lowered his head. He bowed deeply, bending his back in a show of absolute complete submission right in front of the man my father had just publicly called a worthless dirt farmer. Mr. CEO. Richard stammered, his voice shaking with a mixture of profound respect and sheer professional panic. Please forgive my intrusion. I had absolutely no idea you were in town tonight. My executive assistants assured me you were still in Geneva negotiating the European supply chain contracts. If I had known you were gracing our humble event, I would have personally arranged a private table for you at the very front of the room. The collective gasp from the 80 wealthy guests was so loud it actually echoed off the high ceiling. Kendrick, however, did not flinch. He did not look surprised or intimidated by the billionaire's pathetic groveling. He simply stood there radiating that same quiet, unshakable authority he always possessed. He looked down at Richard with a completely neutral expression, casually adjusting the cuff of his simple charcoal suit. I wrapped up my meetings in Switzerland 2 days early. Richard Kendrick said, his voice smooth and quietly commanding. I swallowed hard. His eyes darting nervously, swallowed hard. His eyes darting nervously toward me, for a fraction of a second before quickly looking back down at the polished floor. Of course, Sir Richard replied, his tone sickeningly polite and deferential. I completely understand, and I deeply respect your privacy. It is just an absolute honor to finally have you here in person. I stood completely still, my hand still warmly wrapped in Kendrick's strong grip. I slowly turned my head to look back at the center aisle. My father, Derek, stood completely frozen, with his hand still awkwardly extended in the empty air, his jaw practically resting on his chest. My mother, Yvonne, looked like all the blood had been violently drained from her body, leaving her looking hollow and pale. Chantel was still mid-stumble, her arms frozen in the exact position of her rejected hug, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. And Julian, the arrogant heir who had just threatened to make Kendrick scrub his luxury floors, was staring at his own father, bowing to a common laborer with an expression of absolute shattered reality. The four of them were entirely paralyzed in pure shock, unable to process the total destruction of their fragile world. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut behind us, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted so drastically that it felt as if a violent tornado had just ripped through the country club, tearing the roof completely off. The 80 wealthy guests who had been laughing and gossiping just moments ago were now gripped by a dead, paralyzing silence. It was the kind of deafening quiet that physically hurts your ears, making the air feel impossibly thick and heavy to breathe. No one dared to move a single muscle. No one dared to take a sip of their drinks. Even the professional waitstaff, who were trained to remain completely invisible during events, froze in their tracks, holding their heavy silver trays perfectly still to avoid making even the slightest clinking sound. The soft, romantic lighting of the chandeliers now felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing every single drop of sweat and every twitch of panic on the faces of the people who had just spent the last hour mocking the most powerful man in the room. I stood beside Kendrick, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of his hands still wrapped securely around mine. I looked at the faces of my family members, and it was like watching a slow-motion car crash. My mother, Yvonne, looked exactly like she had just seen a terrifying ghost. The thick layer of expensive makeup she had spent hours applying now looked like a cracked porcelain mask over her pale, trembling skin. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, darting frantically back and forth between Richard's bowed head and Kendrick's perfectly calm face. Her brain was visibly short-circuiting, entirely unable to process the impossible image in front of her. The man she had just ruthlessly insulted. The man she had called a disgusting mistake and a penniless loser was currently receiving the utmost respect from the billionaire she practically worshipped as a god. Chantel was completely frozen in a state of catatonic shock. Her arms, which had been extended for a warm embrace, were now dropping slowly, limply to her sides. The heavy 3-carat diamond ring on her finger caught the light, but it suddenly looked cheap and completely meaningless in the presence of true, staggering wealth. All of her manipulative social climbing, all of her carefully constructed lies and stolen credit cards had been designed to get her into the Kensington family. She had sold her own sister down the river for a taste of this elite lifestyle. And now she was watching the patriarch of that very same empire physically humble himself before the man she had just arrogantly offered a minimum-wage dishwashing job. Her jaw trembled slightly, but she could not produce a single sound. Julian Kensington looked like he was about to vomit right there on the polished marble floor. The arrogant smirk that usually lived permanently on his face had been completely wiped away, leaving behind the terrified expression of a little boy who knew he was about to be punished severely. He looked at his father, then at Kendrick, his pale blue eyes wide with panicked realization. The $50 million eco-resort his family was building, the project he had just loudly bragged about to assert his racial and economic dominance over Kendrick, was entirely dependent on the man standing in the cheap charcoal suit. Julian's entire inheritance, his future position as the head of the company, his luxury lifestyle, everything hung by a single fragile thread that Kendrick was currently holding in his calloused working hands. But out of all of them, my father Derek was the one who simply could not let go of his fabricated reality. His desperation to belong to the upper class was so deeply ingrained in his psyche that his mind aggressively rejected the truth, unfolding right in front of his eyes. Cognitive dissonance violently took over. Derek simply could not accept that he had made such a catastrophic miscalculation. He refused to believe that he had spent the evening humiliating a multi-millionaire CEO while kissing the shoes of a family that was actively begging that same CEO for their business survival. Derek took a hesitant, clumsy step forward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the silent marble floor. He wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He forced a weak, highly unnatural chuckle that sounded like grinding metal in the dead quiet of the ballroom. He genuinely believed that Richard Kensington, the brilliant billionaire businessman, had simply made an embarrassing mistake in identity. He thought he needed to step in and save his future-in-law from making a fool of himself. Sir Derek stammered, his voice cracking pitifully as he desperately tried to break the heavy, terrifying tension in the room. "Mr. Kensington, sir, I believe you are deeply mistaken. You must have this man confused with someone else entirely, someone of actual importance." Richard Kensington, who was still standing with his head slightly bowed out of respect for Kendrick, slowly began to straighten his posture. His broad shoulders tensed under his expensive tailored suit jacket. He did not turn around immediately. He just stood there, letting my father's pathetic, trembling voice wash over him. Derek took another step forward, pointing a shaky, rigid finger directly at Kendrick's chest, entirely oblivious to the massive professional suicide he was committing. "That is not the CEO of a major agricultural trust." Derek continued, his voice growing a fraction louder as he desperately tried to convince both Richard and himself of the lie. "That is just Kendrick. He is my youngest daughter's boyfriend. He is nobody important, sir, I assure you. He is just a broke dirt farmer who works out in the sun all day. He does not have a single dime to his name. He barely even had enough money to buy that cheap suit he is wearing tonight." "You do not need to bow to him, Mr. Kensington. He is absolute trash." The sheer, profound stupidity of my father's words hung in the air like a toxic, suffocating gas. Several wealthy guests in the front row actually gasped out loud, covering their mouths in absolute horror at my father's massive social blunder. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, putting his face in his hands as if he could physically hide from the total destruction that was about to rain down upon all of them. I squeezed Kendrick's hand, feeling a strange mixture of disgust and dark satisfaction, watching my father willingly dig his own grave deeper and deeper with every word he spoke. Richard Kensington slowly turned his body away from Kendrick and faced my father. The billionaire patriarch's face had transformed completely. The nervous, respectful demeanor he had shown to Kendrick was entirely gone. It was immediately replaced by a look of such absolute burning disgust and unadulterated rage that it made my father instantly snap his mouth shut. Richard's eyes were completely cold, filled with a deadly venomous fury, as he stared down at the man who had just insulted the single most important business partner the Kensington Empire had ever encountered. Julian Kensington simply could not read the room. His immense privilege and lifetime of being shielded from any real consequences had left him completely blind to the absolute disaster unfolding right in front of him. He saw his father staring down, my dad with a look of pure murder, but Julian thought he could just smooth it all over with a charming smile and a wave of his hand. He stepped forward, forcing a weak, nervous laugh that echoed painfully in the silent ballroom. Julian reached out and gently grabbed his father's elbow, trying to pull the billionaire away from us. "Dad, come on," Julian said, his voice tight with false amusement. "You are making a massive scene over absolutely nothing. Derek is right. You are just confused. This guy is not a CEO. He is just Zariah's loser boyfriend. He plays in the dirt for a living. Let us go back to the head table and finish the toast." Richard Kensington's reaction was so violent and immediate that several guests actually gasped and took a step back. He physically yanked his arm out of his son's grasp with such incredible force that Julian actually stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance on the polished floor. Richard spun around to face his son, and the look of cold, venomous rage he had just directed at my father was now entirely focused on the arrogant heir of his own empire. Richard stepped directly into Julian's personal space, forcing his taller son to physically cower backward. "Shut your mouth!" Richard roared, his booming voice completely shattering whatever tiny shred of dignity Julian had left. The billionaire did not care that 80 of the most influential people in the city were watching. He did not care that professional photographers were standing just feet away. His entire business legacy was currently dangling over a cliff, and his spoiled son was holding the scissors. "You ignorant, arrogant fool!" Richard hissed, his words cutting through the dead silence of the room like a jagged knife. You stand there in a suit I paid for, wearing a watch I bought for you, and you dare to insult the man who holds our entire future in his hands." Julian's face drained of all color. He opened his mouth to stammer out an apology or an excuse, but his father brutally cut him off, pointing a shaking finger directly at Kendrick's chest. "You want to know who this man is?" Julian Richards shouted, pacing furiously in a small, tight circle. "You want to know who you just called a loser to his face? This is Kendrick Hayes. He is the sole owner and founder of Oasis Agri Trust. He does not just play in the dirt. Julian, he owns the dirt. He owns 50,000 acres of the most prime fertile real estate in Oak Creek County. He owns the exact plot of land you just spent the last 20 minutes bragging about to all of your friends." The collective shock in the room deepened into a state of absolute paralysis. I could actually hear my mother Yvonne let out a tiny pathetic whimper from the back of her throat. Richard was not finished tearing his son apart. "That $50 million eco resort you are so incredibly proud of?" Richard continued, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "It does not exist without him. The exclusive organic supply chain that keeps our luxury restaurants running and keeps your bank accounts full, it all belongs to his company. He could completely bankrupt our new venture tomorrow morning with a single phone call to his legal team. And you have the absolute audacity to stand here and threaten to make him scrub your floors. You threaten the man who could literally buy and sell you before you even wake up in the morning." Julian looked as though he had just been physically struck by a speeding train. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound came out. All of his unearned confidence, all of his racial and economic superiority vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but a terrified, weak little boy staring at the massive destruction he had just caused. He slowly turned his head to look at Kendrick, his eyes wide with a deep, sickening realization. He finally understood that he had brought a plastic toy knife to a heavy artillery gunfight. Chantel was shaking so violently that the expensive beads on her designer dress rattled together. My father, Derek, looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack right there in his rented tuxedo. The man he had verbally abused and tried to kick out of the party was not just rich. He was the quiet, invisible puppet master who controlled the entire Kensington empire. I stood perfectly still, taking in the absolute destruction of the people who had made my life a living hell for 29 years. My parents had completely destroyed their own social standing in less than an hour. They had worshipped the Kensington family name, only to watch the billionaire patriarch bow down to the man they had relentlessly mocked. The poetic justice of the moment was so incredibly sweet it almost brought tears to my eyes. I looked over at Chantel, the golden child who had stolen my identity and built a life on lies. Her perfect night was entirely ruined. Her billionaire catch was currently being publicly humiliated and exposed as a completely powerless, dependent child who owned absolutely nothing of his own. Richard Kensington turned back to Kendrick, his chest heaving heavily from his furious outburst. He lowered his head once again, clasping his hands together in a posture of desperate pleading. "Mr. Hayes," Richard begged, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "Please, I deeply apologize for my son's horrific behavior. He is young and he is incredibly foolish. I assure you his views do not reflect the Kensington Hospitality Group in any way. Please do not let the ignorance of one spoiled child ruin 6 months of careful corporate negotiations between our teams." The ballroom was so incredibly quiet that you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. 80 wealthy elites, my social climbing parents, my manipulative sister, and a billionaire patriarch all held their breath waiting to see what the poor dirt farmer would do next. Kendrick did not look angry. He did not look smug or triumphant. He simply reached up with his large, calloused hands and casually straightened the lapels of his simple charcoal suit. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself directly under the bright chandelier light, and finally addressed the completely silent crowd. Kendrick looked around the room, his dark eyes moving slowly over the faces of the 80 guests who had spent the entire evening looking down on him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The absolute silence in the ballroom carried his deep, steady words perfectly into every corner. Yes. Derek Kendrick began, his gaze settling heavily on my trembling father. You are absolutely right. I am a farmer. I wake up long before the sun rises. I spend my days out in the wide open fields, and I get dirt under my fingernails. I am incredibly proud of the hard, honest work that I do every single day, but you left out one very important detail in your little speech earlier tonight. I just happen to own the very soil that your wealthy future in-laws are desperately trying to build their entire legacy on. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded ballroom, but Kendrick simply held up a calm hand, asking for silence. His eyes shifted from my father to Julian, who was still staring at the marble floor like a beaten and humiliated dog. In fact, Kendrick continued walking slowly closer to the head table where the Kensington family stood frozen. Julian was completely right about one thing. The Kensington Hospitality Group is indeed planning a massive $50 million expansion. What he failed to mention to all of you is that their entire financial projection relies exclusively on securing a 50-year lease on my land. My private property. Without my signature on that contract, that grand eco-resort is absolutely nothing but an empty fantasy drawn on a piece of expensive paper. Richard Kensington closed his eyes tightly as if Kendrick's heavy words were physically painful to listen to, his chest heaving with silent panic. But Kendrick was far from finished. He turned his attention to the wider room, exposing the raw, hidden truth of the mighty Kensington Empire. And the reality goes much deeper than just one real estate project. Kendrick announced, his voice cutting sharply through the heavy tension. For the past 5 years, Oasis Agri Trust has been the primary vendor for every single high-end restaurant in the Kensington portfolio. We currently supply 80% of your organic produce, Julian. Every heirloom tomato, every piece of premium organic beef, every fine bottle of wine you proudly serve to your elite clients comes directly from the hands of the very laborers you just threatened to subjugate and humiliate. You stand here in this lavish country club, eating the food that my people grew, and you have the absolute nerve to call me dirty. Kendrick's words were like physical blows landing perfectly on their targets. He gestured casually to the lavish spread of catered meals sitting on the elegant tables around us. Half the food in this very room was grown on Oasis Agri Trust land, Kendrick pointed out, his tone filled with a quiet, steady disgust. You are entirely dependent on the exact people you look down upon. Kendrick took another deliberate step closer to Julian, forcing the arrogant heir to look up and meet his gaze. I hold your entire supply chain by the throat, Julian, Kendrick said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet and lethal register. If I decide to cancel our corporate contracts tomorrow morning, your restaurant empire will not be able to serve a single meal by the weekend. Your stock prices will absolutely plummet. Your investors will panic, and your board of directors will remove your father from his own company before the month is over. So before you ever decide to look down your arrogant nose at a working man, again, you should probably make sure he does not own the very plate you eat off of. The brutal reality of Kendrick's immense power hung heavily over the room, suffocating everyone in its path. The wealthy guests who had been laughing at his cheap suit just 10 minutes ago were now looking at him with absolute reverence and deep fear. They recognized true stealth wealth, the kind of quiet generational wealth that did not need flashy diamond rings or rented country club ballrooms to validate its own existence. My father, Derek, was physically shaking, gripping the sharp edge of a nearby dining table, just to keep his knees from completely giving out. The heavy gold watch on his wrist suddenly looked incredibly cheap and meaningless. He had spent his entire life judging people by their outward appearances, and it had just cost him everything. He had completely alienated and verbally abused the most powerful man he had ever met in his entire pathetic life. The crushing weight of his colossal mistake was clearly pressing down on his chest, making it difficult for him to even breathe. Chantel was sobbing quietly, her perfectly manicured hands covering her face as her desperate social climbing dreams collapsed into a pile of worthless ashes. Her heavy silk dress dragged on the floor, looking less like a wedding gown and more like a tragic costume. She knew that Julian's fake billionaire persona was entirely ruined, and by extension, so was her perfect wealthy future. They were nothing but two broke scammers who had just been exposed by the real billionaire in the room. The absolute poetic justice of the moment filled my chest with a warm, incredible sense of peace. I watched the mighty Kensington family crumble, and I watched my toxic relatives face the severe consequences of their own cruel actions. The years of being called a failure, the years of being pushed aside so Chantel could shine it all washed away in the quiet, absolute authority of Kendrick's voice. But out of all the incredible reactions unfolding around me, the most sickening one came from the woman who had birthed me. My mother, Yvonne, had always been a ruthless master of survival and emotional manipulation. She possessed an uncanny, terrifying ability to instantly twist any narrative to her own advantage, no matter how shameless or humiliating it made her look in the process. She realized in a fraction of a second that Chantel's wealthy future was dead, and that I was suddenly the only ticket she had left to the upper-class lifestyle she so desperately craved. Yvonne slowly released her death grip on her small designer clutch. She took a deep, shaky breath, her chest heaving as she rapidly calculated the new power dynamic in the room. The terrifying ghost-like pale look completely vanished from her face. It was immediately replaced by a bright, warm, and utterly fake maternal smile that made my stomach turn entirely inside out. She quickly stepped away from my father, pushing past Chantel as if her precious golden child no longer existed. She walked directly toward Kendrick, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her chest, like a devoted worshiper approaching a holy altar, entirely ready to rewrite the entire history of our family to save herself. She batted her eyelashes, trying to look like a sweet, supportive mother who had simply been misunderstood. The rapid pivot was so unnatural and so deeply disturbing that it actually made me take a protective step in front of Kendrick, shielding him from her sudden toxic affection. "Oh, Kendrick, my sweet boy," Yvonne cooed, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickeningly sweet honey that made my skin crawl. She reached out with both hands, attempting to grab his strong arm, but I stood firmly in her path, blocking her access to him. She barely even registered my defensive stance, trying to reach around me, to touch the billionaire she had just moments ago called a dirt farmer. "I always knew there was something incredibly special about you, Kendrick." She gushed, her eyes wide and pleading. "A mother's intuition is never wrong, you know." I looked at you tonight in that handsome suit, and I thought to myself, now that is a man of incredible substance. That is the true son-in-law I have always prayed for to take care of my precious Zariah. My father, Derek, suddenly snapped out of his terrified paralysis, seeing his wife desperately trying to salvage their shattered social standing. He scurried over to us, laughing loudly, a hollow, desperate sound that echoed awkwardly in the silent room. "Oh, yes, absolutely," my father chimed in vigorously, wiping the thick sweat from his brow. "Mr. Hayes, Kendrick, my boy. You have to understand that my little toast earlier was nothing more than a friendly family joke. Just a bit of light-hearted roasting between men, right? We always loved your grounded nature. We deeply respect hard work in this family. We were just playing around to see how Julian would handle the pressure of having a real self-made man in the room. It was a test, and clearly you are the real winner here tonight. You are family Kendrick." The absolute shameless hypocrisy of my parents was staggering. They were standing in front of 80 wealthy guests, openly abandoning their golden child and shamelessly begging the man they had just ruthlessly crucified. They were willing to completely erase 29 years of abuse and neglect in a matter of seconds just because they smelled billions of dollars. I felt a massive surge of pure, righteous anger rise up in my chest, burning away any remaining shred of sympathy or familial duty I had left for these people. I pushed my mother's reaching hands away from Kendrick with a firm, forceful shove. "Do not touch him, Mother," I commanded, my voice ringing out clear and sharp, cutting violently through their pathetic lies. I stared directly into Yvonne's panicked, desperate eyes. "A son-in-law you prayed for?" I asked, tilting my head, mimicking the exact condescending tone she had used on me just 20 minutes ago. "That is incredibly funny because I distinctly remember you digging your fingernails into my bare shoulder and telling me that he was a literal dirt farmer. I remember you whispering viciously in my ear saying he belonged on a dirty tractor and that he was an absolute loser. You looked me dead in the face and told me I was a mistake and a massive burden dragging the family down to the lowest common denominator by bringing him here tonight." My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hand, her fake tears instantly drying up. She looked around frantically, hoping no one had heard me, but the room was so quiet that every single guest caught every devastating word. I refused to let her speak. I turned my furious, burning gaze onto my father, who visibly shrank back under my intense stare. "And you, Dad," I said, stepping closer to him, making sure the entire Kensington family could hear exactly what kind of man he truly was. "A friendly family joke. Is that what you call publicly humiliating us in front of 80 people? You stood on that stage with a glass of expensive champagne in your hand, and you loudly hoped his vegetable harvest would pay for a better dress for me. You told me to dump him and leave the party because he was absolute trash who dared to speak to your precious billionaire in-laws. You do not respect hard work." "Dad," I continued, my voice completely unwavering and utterly cold. "You only love the massive bank accounts that come from it. You and Mother spent my entire life ignoring me and praising Chantel because she knew exactly how to play your fake social climbing game. You worshipped the Kensingtons tonight because you thought they were your golden ticket to the upper class. But the absolute second you realized Kendrick had more money and more power than them, you threw Julian away like useless garbage and tried to sink your greedy, toxic claws into us. You are not parents. You are not a family. You are just pathetic parasites desperately looking for a new host to feed on." The ballroom remained completely dead silent, but the collective disgust radiating from the wealthy guests was incredibly palpable. The affluent socialites who had initially laughed at my father's cruel jokes were now looking at my parents like they were diseased animals that had crawled out of a sewer. They were witnessing the ultimate brutal exposure of a family built entirely on dark lies, emotional manipulation, and toxic greed. No one stepped forward to defend Derek and Yvonne. They were completely isolated, standing in the wreckage of their own arrogant creation. I glanced over at the head table near the front of the room. Richard Kensington, the billionaire patriarch, was watching the entire intense exchange with incredibly cold, calculating eyes. His breathing had slowed down, but his mind was clearly racing. He looked at my mother, desperately trying to cry fake tears to gain sympathy. He looked at my father, sweating heavily and stammering incoherently. He looked at Chantel, who was still sobbing pathetically on the floor, clutching her face in absolute ruin. The brilliant, ruthless businessman inside Richard was rapidly processing the horrific reality of the entire situation. He had initially been furious at his son for insulting a major business partner, but now a much darker truth was dawning on him. He realized that his foolish son Julian was not just marrying a beautiful girl from a slightly lower social class. Julian was blindly attempting to marry into a family of ruthless, manipulative, toxic liars who would easily destroy the prestigious Kensington name for a few quick dollars. Richard Kensington's face hardened into a terrifying mask of pure absolute revulsion. He had spent decades carefully building an empire based on reputation, elitism, and trust. He knew a terrible, disastrous investment when he saw one. And looking at my pathetic family begging and lying on the marble floor, he knew this wedding was the absolute worst mistake his ignorant son had ever attempted to make. Richard Kensington did not offer a single ounce of pity to my begging mother or my sweating father. He looked down at Yvonne, who was still holding her hands together in prayer with a completely blank expression of pure corporate disgust. He simply stepped over her extending foot as if she were a piece of rotting garbage left on the sidewalk. Richard walked directly toward his son Julian, who was still frozen near the front table. The billionaire patriarch had made a cold, calculated decision. If he had to publicly execute his own son's reputation to save his $50 million eco-resort and his massive restaurant empire, he would do it without a single second of hesitation. The Kensington legacy was the only thing Richard truly loved, and he was more than willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood on the altar of corporate survival. "Stand up straight, Julian," Richard barked, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. "You look like a pathetic, weak child." Julian visibly flinched, trying to pull his shoulders back, but he still looked incredibly small under his father's furious gaze. Richard shook his head, his face twisting with absolute disappointment and rage. "What in the world possessed you to bring this absolute trash into my family?" Richard demanded, pointing a sharp finger directly at my parents and then at Chantel, who was still whimpering on the floor. "I raised you to understand the immense value of the Kensington name. I taught you how to protect our legacy from parasites and gold diggers. And yet you invite this absolute circus of manipulative toxic liars into my country club, and you expect me to pay for a lavish wedding." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "Dad, please," he whispered desperately, hoping to quiet his father down. "Everyone is watching us. You are embarrassing the family." "I am embarrassing the family," Richard repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low pitch. "No, Julian. You embarrassed this family the moment you decided to propose to a woman who steals credit cards from her own sister to buy cheap designer knockoffs. You embarrassed this family when you allowed her disgusting parents to insult Mr. Hayes, the single most important man in our entire corporate network. You did not just bring trash into our home, Julian. You willingly rolled around in it, and you almost cost me my entire empire in the process." Richard took a threatening step forward, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. He looked down at Chantel, who was trembling like a cornered rat. "You thought you could marry a Kensington?" Richard sneered, his voice dripping with elitist poison. "We do not marry thieves. We do not marry little girls who steal from their own families just to buy a fake ticket into high society. You are nothing but a cheap imposter, and you will never be a part of this family." Chantel let out a loud gasp, looking up at Richard with wide, terrified eyes. She had spent her entire adult life carefully constructing an image of absolute perfection and wealth. She had lied, cheated, and stolen just to get a seat at this exact table. And now the billionaire patriarch of the family she worshipped was publicly calling her trash to her face in front of 80 of the most influential people in the city. All of her high society dreams were being brutally ripped apart and stomped on right in front of her. "But I love her," Julian pleaded, taking a weak step toward Chantel but not actually reaching out to help her up off the floor. "She told me her family was incredibly wealthy. She told me they had a massive trust fund. I did not know they were just broke social climbers, Dad. I swear I did not know." The sound of Julian throwing Chantel under the bus to save his own skin was incredibly pathetic. They truly deserved each other. Two fake, arrogant scammers constantly lying to themselves and everyone around them. But Richard was not going to let Julian play the innocent victim tonight. The billionaire let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Love." Richard mocked, his eyes filled with absolute venom. "Do not talk to me about love, you foolish boy. You do not even know the meaning of the word. You do not love her. You only proposed to her because you thought her fake trust fund could quietly bail you out of the massive financial disaster you created for yourself. You thought you could use her imaginary money to hide your absolute failures from me and the board of directors. You are a parasite, Julian. Just like the people you invited tonight. Julian's face instantly went completely white. The terrified expression on his face was no longer just about losing a business deal with Kendrick. It was the look of a man whose darkest, most desperate secret was about to be dragged out into the harsh light for everyone to see. "Dad, stop!" Julian begged, his voice cracking completely. "Please do not do this here. Not in front of all these people." But Richard was entirely merciless. "If my empire is going to burn because of your profound stupidity, then your little facade is going to burn right along with it," Richard announced loudly, making sure every single guest in the room could hear the absolute truth about his golden heir. "You stand here in a custom suit, acting like you are the king of the world, treating working men like dirt beneath your shoes. But you do not own a single thing, Julian. You are a complete and utter fraud." Richard turned to face the crowd of wealthy guests, his voice ringing out clear and unforgiving. "My son likes to pretend he is a billionaire heir," Richard stated, pointing a heavy finger at Julian's chest. "But the actual truth is, he is nothing but a degenerate gambling addict. 6 months ago, I discovered that he had secretly drained over $2 million from our corporate expansion accounts to pay off massive illegal offshore gambling debts. He thought he could hide his massive losses from the board of directors by shifting money through dummy corporations, but I caught him. He is incredibly lucky I did not press federal charges and send him to prison just to protect the company." The wealthy socialites gasped loudly, whispering frantically to each other. The perfect Kensington image was completely shattering before their very eyes. Julian covered his face with his hands, unable to look at the people he had just been bragging to minutes ago. "I cut him off entirely," Richard continued, his voice filled with absolute disgust. "I froze his personal bank accounts. I confiscated his corporate credit cards. I completely revoked his access to the family trust fund. He has not had a single dime of Kensington money for 6 full months. He is living in my guest house because he cannot even afford to pay rent on a standard apartment. He cannot even afford the premium gas in his own sports car without begging his mother for a weekly cash allowance. That massive shiny diamond ring he put on Chantel's finger, the one you all clapped for earlier tonight. It is a cheap cubic zirconia fake he bought online for $300 because he is entirely completely broke." The silence that followed Richard's brutal confession was absolutely staggering. The entire dynamic of the room had just flipped entirely upside down. The arrogant prince of the Kensington Empire, the man who had just threatened to make Kendrick scrub the mud off his lobby floors, was actually a penniless gambling addict desperate for a financial bailout. He was a bigger loser than anyone else standing in the room. I watched Chantel as the words slowly processed in her brain. Her loud, pathetic sobbing came to an abrupt, dead stop. The tears instantly dried up on her cheeks. She slowly lowered her manicured hands from her ruined face and stared at Julian. Her wide, panicked eyes dropped down to the massive 3-carat ring on her finger. The ring she had flaunted to all of her friends. The ring she thought proved her ultimate superiority over me. It was completely fake, just like the man who gave it to her. She suddenly realized that she had destroyed her relationship with her only sister, went into massive criminal debt, and sold her entire soul just to marry a man who was actually poorer than the dirt farmer she had relentlessly mocked all night long. The billionaire heir was a broke, desperate fraud, and Chantel's perfect golden future had just instantly turned to dust. The absolute silence in the room was suddenly broken by a sound that resembled a wild animal caught in a metal trap. Chantel let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed violently off the high ceilings of the country club. All the carefully practiced elegance and high society grace she had spent years perfecting evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but pure, unhinged fury. She lunged at Julian with her perfectly manicured hands raised, shoving him backward so hard he stumbled against the edge of the head table, causing several crystal glasses to tip over and shatter on the floor. "You lied to me!" Chantel shrieked, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. Her voice was so loud and shrill it actually made the wealthy guests in the front row physically flinch. "You stood there in your expensive tailored suits, and you let me believe I was marrying a billionaire. You let me brag to all of my friends about the Kensington wealth and the massive estate we were going to live in. You told me we were going to spend our honeymoon on a private yacht in the south of France. And this whole time, you were nothing but a broke, pathetic gambling addict living off a weekly allowance like a child. You are completely worthless, Julian. You have absolutely nothing, and you made a fool out of me in front of everyone I know." Julian caught his balance against the heavy wooden table, and his own face flushed bright red with extreme humiliation and burning anger. He was entirely stripped of his privileged armor and backed into a corner in front of his terrifying father and 80 elite guests. He was not going to stand there and let Chantel play the innocent victim while his entire life collapsed around him. He pushed himself off the table and stepped right back into her face, matching her furious screaming with his own vicious shouting. "Do not act like you are some innocent angel, you manipulative gold digger," Julian roared back, pointing a shaking finger directly at her nose. "You lied to me just as much as I lied to you. The only reason I even looked twice at you was because you spent our first 3 dates bragging about your massive family trust fund. You told me your father was a silent partner in a huge commercial real estate firm in the city. You told me you had millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts just waiting for you to turn 30. Chantel's eyes widened in absolute panic as Julian publicly exposed the massive web of lies she had spun to trap him. My parents, Derek and Yvonne, let out simultaneous gasps of horror from the sidelines. My father physically slumped against a chair, looking like he wanted the polished marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. They had known Chantel was exaggerating her wealth to fit in, but they had no idea she had completely fabricated a multi-million-dollar family trust fund to bait a billionaire heir. The sheer magnitude of her deception was staggering, even to them. I needed a quick infusion of cash to cover my debts before my father found out about the missing corporate funds. Julian confessed, his voice echoing loudly for everyone to hear. I needed a rich wife to bail me out quietly. That is the only reason I bought that cheap, fake cubic zirconia ring and got down on one knee. I thought marrying you would solve all of my financial problems. But you are just as broke as I am, Chantel. Your family is drowning in massive credit card debt. You are wearing a dress you cannot even afford, standing in a room your parents had to take out a high-interest loan just to rent for the night. You are a complete and total fraud. The sheer absolute irony of the entire situation was almost too incredible to comprehend. The guests sat frozen in their chairs, completely captivated by the grotesque spectacle unfolding in front of them. Here was the perfect, flawless couple, the diamond of the family, and the billionaire prince tearing each other to absolute shreds over money that neither of them actually possessed. They had both spent months carefully playing a high-stakes game of deception, trying to scam each other out of a luxurious lifestyle. They were two desperate parasites who had successfully attached themselves to one another only to violently discover that the other host was entirely empty. "You are a disgusting pig!" Chantel screamed, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. She raised her hand and slapped Julian hard across the face, the sound ringing out sharply in the tense air. The heavy, fake diamond ring scratched against his cheek, leaving a bright red, angry mark. "You ruined my life, Julian. You ruined everything I worked so hard for. You ruined your own life," Julian spat back, pressing his trembling hand to his stinging cheek. "You stole your own sister's identity just to buy expensive shoes to impress people who do not even care about you. We deserve each other, Chantel. We are both completely empty inside, and now everyone knows it. I stood beside Kendrick, watching the ultimate destruction of the two people who had just spent the entire evening looking down on us. Chantel and Julian were completely exposed, stripped of their fake wealth, their fake prestige, and their fake love. They were left with absolutely nothing but the bitter, toxic truth. The wealthy guests who had come to celebrate a high society union were now looking at them with a mixture of deep pity and profound disgust. The prestigious Kensington name was being dragged through the mud, and my parents' social climbing dreams were dead and buried forever. But while the two broke scammers continued to scream and cry at each other, near the shattered champagne glasses, the real power dynamic in the room remained incredibly quiet and utterly terrifying. Richard Kensington, the patriarch who had just publicly executed his own son's reputation, slowly turned his attention away from the pathetic argument. His chest was still heaving with anger, but his cold, calculating eyes locked onto Kendrick once again. Richard knew that exposing his son was only the first step in his desperate attempt at damage control. He had sacrificed Julian to prove a point to the man standing beside me. But the $50 million eco-resort and the exclusive organic supply chain were still hanging by a single highly fragile thread. Richard took a deep, shaky breath, attempting to compose himself, pulling his expensive tailored jacket straight. He prepared to beg the man he had just met for the very survival of his empire. I looked up at Kendrick. His broad shoulders were perfectly relaxed, but his jaw was set in a tight, unforgiving line. Kendrick did not look at Chantel, sobbing on the floor. He did not look at Julian or my trembling parents. His dark, intense eyes were fixed entirely on Richard Kensington, the quiet farmer who controlled thousands of acres of land and millions of dollars in corporate contracts, simply stared at the billionaire patriarch with a look so incredibly cold and deeply unyielding that it made the temperature in the room feel as though it had suddenly plummeted. The ultimate business deal was completely on the line, and Kendrick was holding the heavy executioner's axe. The silence that followed was suddenly broken by a sound I never expected to make in a room full of people who had just spent the evening mocking me. I started to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle bubbling up from deep inside my chest, but as the sheer absurdity of the entire situation washed over me, it grew into a full, loud laugh. I stood there in my simple dress holding the hand of the billionaire farmer they had all called a loser, and I laughed at the absolute ridiculousness of my toxic family and the mighty Kensington Empire. The golden child and the arrogant heir were nothing but two broke, desperate frauds. They had spent months lying to each other, lying to their families, and lying to themselves just to secure a lifestyle that neither of them could actually afford. They were a perfect match, made in a shallow, empty hell. My laughter echoed through the quiet ballroom, and Chantel snapped her head toward me. Her face was smeared with expensive makeup, and her eyes were wild with humiliation. She wanted to scream at me again to blame me for her ruined life, but she had absolutely no ammunition left. The wealthy guests were not looking at me with disgust anymore. They were looking at Chantel and Julian like they were a tragic comedy act hired for the evening's entertainment. Chantel looked back at Julian, her chest heaving as she finally processed the absolute worthlessness of the man standing in front of her. She looked down at her hand trembling as she stared at the massive shiny stone that had been the ultimate symbol of her triumph over me. "You bought me a fake ring, Chantel," whispered her voice, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and pure agony. "You let me walk around for weeks showing this piece of cheap glass to my friends, telling them it was a flawless Kensington family heirloom. You let me look like an absolute fool." Julian scowled, crossing his arms over his chest like a defensive teenager caught in a lie. "What did you expect me to do?" "Chantel," he shot back defensively. My father froze. All my accounts. I literally had $40 in my checking account when I proposed to you. I went online and found a replica cubic zirconia ring that looked heavy enough to pass for a real diamond. You were so blinded by the Kensington name that you did not even bother to have it appraised. You just saw what you wanted to see because you are just as shallow as I am. The brutal confirmation that the ring was completely fake was the final nail in the coffin of Chantel's grand delusion. She let out a choked sob, grabbing the ring with her other hand and violently yanking it off her finger. It scraped against her knuckle, leaving a red mark, but she did not care. She threw the fake diamond directly at Julian's chest with all the strength she had left. The cheap ring hit his expensive jacket and bounced off, landing on the polished marble floor with a dull, hollow clink that sounded incredibly sad in the large room. "I am done!" Chantel cried out, her voice finally breaking completely. She collapsed onto the floor, her heavy silk dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The golden child, the pride and joy of my parents, the woman who had stolen my identity and constantly reminded me of my own supposed failures, was now a crumpled, crying mess on the floor of a rented country club. My mother, Yvonne, tried to take a step toward her, but she hesitated, looking nervously at the wealthy guests who were watching the spectacle with undisguised judgment. My mother cared more about what those strangers thought of her than she cared about comforting her own broken daughter. My father, Derek, stood frozen near the edge of the room, watching his entire world collapse in real time. He had mortgaged his house and drained his retirement accounts just to rent this country club and buy the expensive catered food that nobody was eating. He had done it all to impress a billionaire family that was now publicly offering to sacrifice their own son just to appease the man my father had called a loser. The sheer financial ruin facing my parents was monumental. They had bet absolutely everything on Chantel's ability to marry into money, and now they were left with a massive pile of debt and a daughter who was sobbing on the floor clutching a ruined dress. They had pushed me away, their only financially stable child, in favor of a golden child who had built her entire existence on a foundation of sand. Watching them slowly realize the gravity of their massive failure was deeply satisfying. Julian did not even look down at the woman he was supposed to marry. He just stared at the fake ring on the floor, his face completely blank. The engagement was officially over, destroyed by a mutual web of pathetic lies and empty promises. The 80 guests began to murmur among themselves, the scandal already spreading through their tight-knit social circle like wildfire. Julian Kensington was a broke gambling addict, and his bride was a fake heiress. The story would be the only thing anyone talked about for the next 10 years. But while the socialites focused on the dramatic end of the fake romance, Richard Kensington was focused entirely on survival. He completely ignored his crying son and the weeping woman on the floor. He stepped over the discarded cubic zirconia ring, crunching it under the heel of his expensive leather shoe without a second thought. Richard walked directly up to Kendrick, the arrogant billionaire, completely replacing his pride with desperate survival instincts. The Kensington Hospitality Group was bleeding out, and Kendrick was the only man who could stop it. Richard stopped just 2 feet away from Kendrick, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Hayes," Richard began, his voice lower, now meant only for Kendrick and me to hear. "I know that my son has caused an unforgivable offense tonight. I know that his ignorance and arrogance have deeply insulted you and your partner. But I am begging you as a businessman not to let the foolish actions of one broke addict destroy an empire that took 3 generations to build." Richard took a deep breath, his eyes darting frantically to Kendrick's completely unreadable face. "The $50 million eco-resort is the future of my company," Richard pleaded. "The supply chain contracts we have with Oasis Agri Trust are the lifeblood of our restaurants. If you walk away tonight, thousands of people will lose their jobs and my legacy will be entirely wiped out. I am willing to do whatever it takes to secure your signature on that land lease. Name your absolute price, Mr. Hayes." I watched Richard Kensington, The man who had built a massive empire stand in front of my boyfriend and offer up his own flesh and blood like a sacrificial lamb. The sheer coldness of the billionaire was staggering. He did not care about Julian's future or well-being. He only cared about the profit margins and the stock prices. He was willing to throw his son onto the streets with absolutely nothing, just to appease the true power in the room. The wealthy guests, who were trying so hard to pretend they were not listening, were hanging on to every single word, waiting to see how the quiet farmer would pass judgment on the elite ruling class. Kendrick held the absolute power to destroy 2 families tonight, and he had not even raised his voice once. Kendrick just looked at him, his expression remaining incredibly calm and detached. "Your son threatened to make my people scrub your floors," Richard Kendrick pointed out quietly. "He insulted the woman I love in front of a room full of people." "We'll remove the problem entirely. Richard will remove the problem entirely," Richard stated, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. "If you sign the land lease tonight, I will legally disown Julian tomorrow morning. I will publicly strip him of the Kensington name, I will remove him from the company board, and I will ensure he never receives another dime of family money for the rest of his natural life. I will completely erase him to save this deal." Kendrick stared at the billionaire patriarch for a long, quiet moment. The offer to completely destroy his own flesh and blood just to save a business deal hung in the air like a foul, toxic scent. It showed exactly what kind of man Richard Kensington truly was, and it solidified every single instinct Kendrick had about this family. Slowly, Kendrick shook his head. A small, almost imperceptible look of pure disgust crossed his strong features. "You think this is just about a signature on a piece of paper?" Richard Kendrick asked, his voice low and incredibly firm. "You think you can just throw your son away like a defective piece of broken equipment? And I will gladly shake your hand and hand over my land to you. You allowed your son to stand here and viciously insult the woman I love. You stood by completely silent while he threatened to make working-class people scrub the mud off your luxury floors. You watched him treat my partner and my people like they were absolutely nothing. That kind of profound arrogance is not just a single mistake Julian made tonight. It is the exact toxic culture you deliberately bred into your entire corporate empire." Kendrick took a deliberate step back, effectively closing the door on the negotiations forever. "The land lease is entirely dead," Richard Kendrick announced, his words ringing out like a final death knell for the $50 million eco-resort. "I will never allow a Kensington to build a single foundation on my soil. And as for our current corporate agreements, you can consider them permanently void. As of tomorrow morning, Oasis Agri Trust will completely cease all supply deliveries to every single location in your restaurant chain. I suggest you tell your executive chefs to start looking for a new place to buy their premium organic produce, because my trucks will not be backing into your loading docks ever again." Richard Kensington let out a sharp, audible gasp. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like an old, frail, terrified man. He stumbled back a half step, his hand frantically clutching the edge of a nearby dining table to keep himself from collapsing onto the polished marble floor. The realization that his massive empire was about to come crashing down completely paralyzed him. The stock market was going to slaughter his hospitality company by Monday morning. His board of directors was going to demand his immediate resignation. The prestigious legacy he had just spent the last 20 minutes bragging about to 80 wealthy guests was officially over, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The sheer panic in Richard's eyes quickly morphed into a blind, violent rage. He spun around and marched directly toward Julian, who was still standing completely frozen near the shattered crystal champagne glasses. Richard did not say another word to Kendrick or my parents. He simply reached out with both hands and grabbed his adult son roughly by the expensive collar of his tailored jacket. Julian let out a pathetic yelp of fear as his father physically yanked him forward, almost lifting him off his feet. "Get out!" Richard snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl that echoed across the silent room. "You have destroyed absolutely everything. Get out of my sight before I kill you myself." Julian stumbled clumsily as his father aggressively dragged him down the center aisle. The 80 elite guests parted immediately, completely terrified of getting in the way of the furious billionaire patriarch. Richard hauled his son toward the heavy oak doors, dragging the disgraced broke heir out of the exclusive country club and out of high society forever. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a loud, echoing thud, leaving behind a thick, uncomfortable silence in the grand ballroom. The mighty Kensington family was gone, and the so-called wedding of the century was officially completely destroyed. I stood there taking a slow, deep breath as the reality of what just happened finally settled over the massive room. The absolute poetic justice of the moment was almost overwhelming. The people who had tried to crush us were now the ones buried under the rubble of their own arrogance. I turned my attention back to the wreckage left behind in our dark corner. Chantel was still sitting on the floor, crying softly into her hands, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her completely fake life. Her golden future was gone. But it was the look on my parents' faces that truly captured the massive magnitude of the absolute disaster. My father, Derek, and my mother, Yvonne, were left standing entirely alone in the absolute ruins of their pathetic social climbing dreams. They had mortgaged their family home, they had maxed out multiple high-interest credit cards, and they had alienated their only successful child, all for a chance to rub elbows with a billionaire family that had just publicly imploded. The reality of their massive, crushing debt was finally sinking in. The bills for the expensive catered food that nobody was eating, the massive floral arrangements, the renting of the elite venue, all of it was going to fall squarely on their shoulders. They had absolutely no money left to pay for any of it. They had no prestige. The wealthy guests they had tried so desperately to impress were now quietly gathering their coats and whispering harshly, making their way toward the exits to avoid being associated with the humiliating scandal. Derek looked around the rapidly emptying ballroom, his shoulders sagging heavily as the massive, crushing weight of his financial ruin finally hit him. His chest heaved as he realized he was about to lose everything he owned. Yvonne wiped her face, smearing her expensive makeup even further, making her look desperate and completely unhinged. They slowly realized that their golden child was a broke fraud, and their billionaire ticket was a gambling addict. They realized that the only person left in the entire room who possessed any actual wealth, any actual power, and any ability to save them from total bankruptcy was the very daughter they had treated like absolute garbage for 29 years. Very slowly, my parents turned their desperate, tear-filled eyes away from the exit and locked them directly onto me. My father took a trembling step forward, his expensive dress shoes dragging heavily across the polished floor. His face was completely stripped of the arrogant pride he had worn like a mask for my entire life. He looked like a broken, pathetic shell of a man. "Zariah," he croaked, his voice cracking under the massive weight of his own sudden destruction. "Zariah, please, you have to talk to him. You have to make Mr. Hayes change his mind." My mother, Yvonne, did not just walk toward me. She practically threw herself across the short distance separating us and collapsed directly onto her knees right at my feet. The woman who had spent 29 years looking down on me was now kneeling on the cold marble floor of a rented country club, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her heavy silk gown pooled around her knees, entirely ruined. "Please, my baby girl." Yvonne begged, her hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my simple dress. "You are the only one who can save us now. You know we do not have the money to pay for this venue. We took out massive loans to pay for Chantel's wedding. If the Kensingtons walk away, we are completely bankrupt. You cannot let them do this to us. We are your family, Zariah. We are your own flesh and blood. Blood is thicker than water. You have to show some family loyalty." I looked down at my mother kneeling on the floor and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, just a profound, hollow emptiness where my love for her used to reside. I slowly reached down and peeled her desperate, trembling hands off my dress finger by finger. I took a deliberate step back, putting a physical boundary between myself and the toxic people who had birthed me. Blood, I asked, my voice echoing clearly in the dead silent ballroom. You want to talk to me about blood and family loyalty right now? Where was that family loyalty when you let Chantel steal my identity and rack up $40,000 in credit card debt? Where was that blood connection when you forced me to pay your medical bills while your golden child partied in Las Vegas? Where was your precious maternal love 20 minutes ago when you dug your nails into my shoulder and told me I was a mistake and a massive burden to this family? My mother flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to spout another pathetic lie, but I cut her off entirely. My voice was not angry or screaming like Chantel's had been. It was perfectly calm, cold, and completely unyielding. You do not care about family, Mother, I stated, looking down at both of them. You only care about survival and status. For my entire life, you treated me like I was completely invisible. You pushed me aside. You belittled my career. You mocked my choices. And you constantly compared me to a sister who was nothing but a manipulative fraud. You placed all of your bets on Chantel. You bet your house, your retirement, and your entire social standing on the desperate hope that she would marry into a billionaire family and drag you up the social ladder with her. I paused, letting my words sink deep into their panicked minds. You thought you were so incredibly smart playing your little high society games, but you bet on the completely wrong daughter. And now you have lost absolutely everything. My father let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying his face in his trembling hands. Zariah, please, he wept. We made a mistake. We were wrong. We can fix this. We can be a real family now. There is nothing left to fix, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet finality. You do not get to treat me like garbage for 3 decades and then suddenly pretend to love me just because my boyfriend happens to be a millionaire. I am not your backup plan. I am not your financial safety net. And I am certainly not your daughter anymore. I am completely done protecting you. I am done paying for your mistakes. From this moment forward, you are entirely on your own. I turned my back on my weeping parents, feeling a massive, suffocating weight permanently lift off my shoulders. Kendrick was waiting for me, his hand extended and his eyes filled with a deep, quiet pride. I reached out and placed my hand firmly in his, ready to finally walk out of this toxic nightmare and start my real life. But before we could even take a single step toward the heavy oak doors, a sudden frantic movement caught my eye. Chantel, who had been crying silently on the floor, suddenly scrambled to her feet and made one last desperate unhinged lunge toward us. Chantel threw herself forward, her ruined white silk dress tangling around her legs as she frantically grabbed a fistful of my clothing. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, tangled bird's nest, and her face was heavily streaked with dark black mascara. The smug, arrogant golden child was entirely gone, completely replaced by a terrified, desperate woman facing the absolute destruction of her fake life. Zariah. Wait! Chantel screamed, her voice raw and scratching painfully against her throat. You cannot just leave me here. Julian is gone. He is broke. He cannot pay off the venue or the caterers. The creditors are going to come after me. They are going to see that I have absolutely no money in my accounts. You have to help me, Zariah. You have to ask Kendrick to write a check. It is just pocket change to him. Please, Zariah, I am begging you. I will do anything. I stopped walking and slowly turned my head to look at my older sister. The sister who had bullied me, stolen from me, and humiliated me at every single opportunity she ever had. She was gripping my dress so tightly her knuckles were completely white, begging for a financial handout from the very same man she had just proudly offered a minimum wage dishwashing job to. The sheer, blinding audacity of her request was truly magnificent to witness. I looked down at her shaking hands and then looked directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I did not yell. I did not scream. I simply reached down and completely removed her grip from my clothing, smoothing out the wrinkled fabric with a calm, deliberate motion. "If you need money to pay off your massive debts, Chantel," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and dripping with absolute ice, "you should probably ask your wealthy white in-laws to help you out." I paused, pretending to look around the completely empty space where Julian and Richard Kensington had been standing just minutes before. "Oh, wait," I added, a small, cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "They are gone." Chantel let out a devastated broken wail, collapsing back onto her knees as the final realization hit her. There was no bailout coming. There was no magical rescue. She was going to have to face the severe, brutal consequences of her own actions for the very first time in her entire privileged life. I turned away from her for the very last time. Kendrick gently placed his warm, solid hand on the small of my back, guiding me forward. We began to walk slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The 80 wealthy elites who had spent the evening whispering and laughing at us now scrambled frantically to get out of our way. They stepped back, pulling their expensive chairs with them, parting exactly like the Red Sea to let us through. They did not make a single sound. They did not dare to look us in the eye. They simply watched us walk past with a mixture of absolute awe and deep, terrifying respect. They knew they had just witnessed a massive shift in power, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship we were leaving behind. We reached the heavy oak doors and Kendrick pushed them open, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air. The sky was incredibly clear, filled with bright, shining stars. I took a massive, deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean air, leaving the suffocating, toxic smell of my family completely behind me. We walked down the grand stone steps of the country club hand in hand, never looking back at the lavish building or the ruined people crying inside of it. Fast forward exactly 6 months. The fallout from that disastrous engagement party was absolutely spectacular. My parents were completely bankrupted by the massive bills from the country club. They were forced to sell their sprawling colonial home and move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the bad side of town. They lost their country club memberships, they lost their wealthy friends, and they became complete social pariahs in their own community. Nobody wanted to associate with the family that had tried to scam the Kensington Empire. Chantel fared even worse. Without a rich husband to bail her out, her massive mountain of credit card debt finally caught up with her. She was forced to declare official bankruptcy and take a minimum wage retail job just to survive. Her fake designer handbags were repossessed, and her perfectly curated social media accounts went completely dark. She was forced to live in the real world she had spent her entire life running away from. As for me, my life completely flourished once I cut the toxic deadweight from my shoulders. I received a massive promotion at the design agency, stepping into the role of senior art director. I no longer spent my nights stressing over my mother's medical bills or my sister's hidden debts. I spent my time building a beautiful, peaceful life with the man who truly saw my worth. Kendrick and I were currently standing on the massive wrap-around porch of our farmhouse, looking out over the 50,000 acres of pristine land that belonged entirely to us. Kendrick reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He did not need a room full of 80 wealthy socialites to prove his love for me. He just needed a quiet sunset and a simple, beautiful diamond ring that was 100% real. Have you ever watched karma entirely handle the people who tried to destroy you? Let me know your stories in the comments below.